Truth has a curious way of surviving. It can be buried beneath centuries of manipulation, smothered by tradition, and twisted by the mouths of kings and councils, yet it lingers like a quiet ember refusing to die. If we dare to examine the roots of Christianity, not the living faith of the soul, but the institutional edifice that was built upon it, we will find not merely divine inspiration, but human invention. What has been presented as eternal truth was, in many cases, the result of calculated lies. Political strategies dressed in sacred robes. Let us dare, then, to unveil 10 of these lies, not to tear down faith, but to expose the fragile scaffolding upon which power rested. The first lie was the idea that the words of a few men could perfectly capture the infinite. Councils decided which texts were inspired and which were heretical, not by revelation but by majority vote. What was divine became a matter of politics. The canon was not carved in stone from heaven. It was debated, argued, and enforced by decree. The second lie was that authority flowed downward through a chain of bishops, as though God could be trapped in a hierarchy. In truth, the earliest gatherings of believers were communities, equal in their humility, but power. Hungry men reshaped them into pyramids of control. From shepherds of souls they became rulers of empires. The third lie was that questioning the institution was equal to questioning God. This gave mortals the audacity to silence prophets, thinkers, and seekers. They built fear into the very marrow of the faith, ensuring obedience not to heaven, but to those who claimed to speak for it. The fourth lie was that salvation could be bought or mediated by ritual. What began as a simple call to love and faith was soon entangled in sacraments and indulgences. Forgiveness was no longer a gift of grace, but a commodity exchanged by the powerful. The fifth lie was the rewriting of history itself. Pagan customs, myths, and festivals were baptized into the new order, their origins buried under the weight of doctrine. What was once foreign was renamed Christian, until the faithful no longer knew what was borrowed and what was born from their own scriptures. The sixth lie was the suppression of women. Though the earliest communities were filled with their voices, courage, and leadership, men swiftly erased their roles, binding the story of redemption to masculine authority. Half the human race was silenced in the name of order. The seventh lie was the promise of empire disguised as kingdom. When rulers claimed divine sanction, the message of humility was harnessed for conquest. Crosses were carried into battle, not as signs of sacrifice, but as weapons of legitimacy. The eighth lie was that unity required uniformity. The living diversity of thought and belief was crushed beneath the hammer of creeds. Those who disagreed, however faithfully, were branded heretics. Unity was preserved not by love, but by fear. The ninth lie was the claim that heaven and hell were bargaining chips, manipulated to control human behavior. The eternal became a tool of temporal power. The mystery of eternity was used to frighten peasants and kings alike into submission. The 10th lie was the greatest of all, that God could be owned by an institution. That truth could be monopolized, that the infinite could be reduced to the walls of a church, the rules of a council, the decrees of a pope, or the words of one translation. In this lie, the mystery of God was domesticated, caged, and sold. And yet, despite all this, the ember of truth still glows. For the lies of men cannot extinguish the voice of eternity. The foundation may have been mixed with sand and straw, but the divine voice whispers still in the cracks. We are left with a choice: cling to the illusions crafted by power, or dare to seek the living truth beyond them. For faith is not in the lies that built the institution, but in the flame that refuses to be quenched. Power has always had a way of reshaping faith, bending it from a living encounter with the divine into a structure that could be governed, controlled, and made predictable. What began as a movement of ordinary men and women sharing bread, hope and courage quickly became the subject of political debates and imperial ambitions. Councils were convened not in the spirit of seeking truth alone, but in the pursuit of consensus that could stabilize kingdoms and empires. The scriptures, which were once fluid collections of letters, poems, and testimonies, were bound together through decisions made by majority vote, not heavenly revelation. The divine was reduced to a list of what could be read and what must be silenced. Gospels that challenged authority or painted a different portrait of the divine were branded as dangerous, and they vanished under the weight of official decree. In this way, politics disguised itself as holiness, and faith was turned into a set of rules defined by those in power. The notion that the eternal could be contained within the agreements of bishops and emperors is itself one of the greatest illusions. It was not the purity of the message that mattered most in these gatherings, but the ability to unify, to control dissent, and to preserve a fragile order in a restless empire. Every creed that emerged carried with it not just words of belief, but the fingerprints of the men who wrote it. The tragedy is not that order was sought, for human beings crave clarity and direction, but that the search for power overshadowed the freedom of faith. Instead of a wide table where seekers could wrestle honestly with mystery, a narrow path was laid down and enforced with authority. Those who stepped outside it were cast away, not because they lacked devotion, but because their devotion threatened the system that had been built. Faith, which should have been as free as air and as wild as fire, was pressed into the shape of politics. It became a tool not simply for worship, but for governance, a way to bind people together not in love, but in loyalty to rulers. This reshaping of faith into politics set the stage for centuries of control, where the voice of heaven was confused with the voice of men in power, and the line between truth and decree became almost indistinguishable. Fear is the most effective chain ever forged, and it was wrapped tightly around the heart of faith. Where there was once freedom to ask, to wrestle, and to search, there came a suffocating silence born of threats and warnings. To question the institution became to question God himself, as though the eternal could be reduced to the fragile words of councils or the decrees of rulers. This lie gave men the power to claim that doubt was rebellion, that curiosity was sin, and that disagreement was damnation. In such a climate, faith was no longer a living journey, but a prison where the walls were built of fear. Believers were taught to tremble, not only before God, but before those who claimed to speak in his name. The authority of men was fused with the authority of heaven, and to resist one was to resist both. Through this fear, obedience was carved into the soul, and countless voices that might have enriched the faith were silenced before they could even rise. Instead of dialogue, there was decree. Instead of discovery, there was demand. Instead of hearts set free to pursue truth, there were minds shackled by the terror of exclusion. Communities that once flourished in diversity of thought and expression learned to hide their questions, to swallow their doubts, and to live in the shadow of judgment. Even the natural tension of faith, the balance between belief and uncertainty, was outlawed, leaving only the rigid obedience that served institutions rather than souls. Fear became the currency of control, traded freely by those who sought not the growth of spirit, but the maintenance of order. And so a paradox was born. The faith that claimed to bring freedom bound men and women in chains, and the truth that was meant to set them free was kept out of reach by the threat of punishment. What should have been the courage to walk with God in mystery was replaced by the terror of stepping out of line with the institution. In this way, fear became the silent ruler, more powerful than kings or priests, more enduring than armies, shaping generation after generation to believe that obedience was safer than honesty, and silence holier than truth, the distortion of sacred truth, for control stands among the most devastating manipulations in history. What began as a message of love, grace, and the direct connection between the soul and its creator was reshaped into a system where access to forgiveness and salvation could be mediated by rituals and transactions. The idea that grace could be earned or purchased twisted the simplicity of faith into something that could be measured, sold, and guarded by gatekeepers. Indulgences became symbols of this corruption, where even eternity seemed to carry a price tag. The institution that should have pointed the way to freedom instead turned faith into commerce, and those who longed for peace were left believing they could only find it through the hands of the powerful. The manipulation did not stop with forgiveness, but extended to every corner of human life. Rulers wrapped conquest in the cloak of divine sanction, convincing armies that their battles were holy and their bloodshed justified. The humility of the cross, once a sign of sacrifice, was transformed into a banner for empire. Sacred truth was no longer the whisper of grace, but the roar of political ambition. This distortion reached even into the promises of eternity, where the mystery of heaven and hell was wielded as a tool of fear. Eternal joy was dangled as a reward for compliance, and eternal torment threatened as the price for disobedience. The infinite was reduced to leverage, the unknowable turned into an instrument of power. In such a world, faith was no longer a personal encounter with the divine, but a set of obligations and bargains designed to preserve the authority of the institution. Those who challenged the system were not simply disagreeing with men, they were branded as enemies of God. Their voices silenced under the weight of accusations that they endangered souls. Yet beneath all these manipulations lay a deeper tragedy. The very truths that could have liberated humanity were overshadowed by lies designed to control it. The message of grace, meant to lift burdens, was buried under new burdens of law and ritual. The call to love, meant to unite, was twisted into justification for conquest and division. The longing for eternity, meant to comfort, was distorted into a tool to terrify. In this way, sacred truth became less about transformation of the heart and more about preservation of authority, leaving generations unable to distinguish between the living God and the voices of those who sought power in his name. The greatest illusion ever sold was that the infinite could be caged, owned or controlled by any institution. The idea that God could be monopolized, that truth could be neatly packaged within the boundaries of a church or the decrees of a council, is itself a denial of the very nature of the divine. What is eternal cannot be reduced to the walls of stone, nor can mystery be captured in the language of one translation or the rituals of one order. Yet this was the claim made, that within a single structure lay the sole access to God, that outside its borders there was only darkness. It was a lie that granted immense power to those who upheld it, for in declaring themselves the keepers of God, they became the gatekeepers of human destiny. Generations were taught to believe that their hope, their forgiveness, and their very souls depended not on the infinite One, who transcends all boundaries, but on the approval of men clothed in authority. This illusion fed the machinery of control, silencing those who found God outside its walls, condemning those whose encounters with the divine did not fit the prescribed mold. And yet the divine is like the wind, untamed and uncontained, blowing where it wills. No decree can limit its reach, no counsel can define its essence, no ritual can exhaust its meaning. The attempt to cage God is not only futile but destructive, for it turns the boundless into the bounded, the infinite into the institutional, and the living faith into a lifeless order. Those who sought to own God robbed countless souls of the freedom to seek Him directly, convincing them that salvation was not a matter of personal faith, but of institutional loyalty. The tragedy lies not only in the deception, but in the lost opportunities for countless lives to flourish in the fullness of divine mystery. Faith became narrower, smaller, domesticated, stripped of its wild beauty, its wonder reduced to rules, and its joy to obligations. In truth, the infinite cannot be contained, and every attempt to cage it reveals more about the fears of men than the reality of God. For what is eternal will always break free of the walls built around it, whispering to those who dare to listen beyond the boundaries of tradition and decree,